Sawyer Ridge hadn't spoken a word to another soul in over 3 months. His days passed like the dust across his porch, slow, weightless, and unnoticed. The ranch he called home was more bones than shelter, now creaking in the wind like a ghost refusing to move on. For 15 long years, the land had held him prisoner not by force but by memory. The laughter of his wife and daughter still echoed in the empty rooms. He didn't dare speak out loud, it might chase their voices away. But that day under the hard noon sun, the silence broke. It began with a sound he hadn't heard in what felt like another lifetime: voices. Faint at first, like wind carried from far off, then sharper, closer, human. Sawyer dropped the hammer in his hand and turned toward the main road. There in the wavering heat shapes emerged 3 women, each with a child clinging to their skirts or cradled in their arms. They were walking with the heavy gait of people who had nowhere left to go. He felt it before he understood it. Something inside him shifting like a door he thought was rusted shut, creaking open just enough to let the dust stir. The first woman, her dark hair half loosened from a worn-out bonnet, stepped with a kind of stubborn grace. Her dress was faded, her face streaked with fatigue, but her eyes were alert. Behind her, another woman carried a bundled infant, and a third guided a trembling boy through the dirt. The smallest child, a toddler, tripped, hit the ground, and let out a cry that cut deeper than it should have. One of the women scooped her up without hesitation. That's when Sawyer's chest tightened. These weren't visitors, they weren't neighbors, they were running. His hand reached for the rifle leaning against the fence post, not in anger but instinct. Out here, surprise visits were rarely innocent. People didn't just pass through Sawyer Ridge's land, not without a reason. They were 20 yards out when the lead woman raised her hand. "Sir," she called out, her voice clear but threaded with exhaustion. "We don't mean you any harm. We just need to talk, please." Sawyer didn't move. The woman continued, taking careful steps forward. "My name is Eliza Cooper. These are my friends Ruthie and Nora. We've been walking since before sunrise." Her gaze flicked to the children, then back to him. "We're not asking for much, just a place to rest for the night." The children, they can't go any farther. There was something in her voice, not weakness, but the kind of resolve that only forms in people who've been refused too many times and still keep going. Sawyer felt it press against the wall he'd built around himself. He hadn't let anyone cross his threshold in over a decade. He hadn't wanted to. People brought questions, people brought risk, and risk for him had always meant loss. But standing in the heat, watching those children press closer to their mothers like shadows needing light, he knew some choices don't wait for permission. He gestured toward the house. It wasn't heroism, it wasn't charity. It was something older than either recognition. Recognition of hunger in the eyes of a boy who hadn't eaten since yesterday, of bone-deep fear in the spine of a woman who kept scanning the horizon, of the way a child clutched her mother's dress like it was the only safe place left in the world. When the women crossed the threshold, the silence inside the house felt like it might break in two. Dust caught in Sunbeam's furniture, unused for years, shelves long forgotten. One of the children pointed at the fireplace. "No fire," Sawyer said quietly. "Haven't needed it." Or maybe, Eliza replied, settling on a bench with the toddler on her lap, "You just got used to the cold." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Her words had landed true. Sawyer Ridge had once been a man who spoke with conviction, who laughed without shame. But the day he lost his family, he buried more than 2 people. He buried himself. And now, standing in a house full of strangers who felt more honest than any conversation he'd had in years, he began to wonder if some parts of a man, when shaken hard enough, could wake again. Outside, the sun still scorched the earth. But inside, something else had begun to stir. Something alive. The morning had already passed by the time Sawyer Ridge saw them, 3 women moving up the dusty lane, slow but steady, as if each step had been bargained from the earth. The light shimmered off the dry soil, blurring their forms at first until they were more heat mirage than flesh and bone. But as they came closer, the shapes took on weight. Mothers, children. One woman carried a sleeping baby swaddled in a pale cloth, its face tucked beneath her chin. Another held tightly to the hand of a boy who looked no older than 8. The lead woman, dark-haired, dirt-smudged, and unflinching, walked with a tired kind of resolve. Her bonnet had slipped back, revealing strands of sweat-damp hair clinging to her cheekbones. And when the smallest girl stumbled in the road and burst into tears, it wasn't the cry that caught Sawyer's attention. It was how fast the woman reacted, scooping the child up in one smooth, practiced motion without slowing her pace. He'd seen movements like that before. Mothers running, not just traveling, escaping. Sawyer dropped the wrench he'd been using to fix the front gate and rested his hand just above the rifle, leaning against the post. He didn't lift it, not yet. But it was a habit born of too many years out here, where the lines between safety and threat were always drawn in dirt and distance. No one came this way by accident. The group was maybe 30 yards out when the lead woman stopped. She raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more a cautious signal, and called out in a voice that was both firm and weary. "Sir," she said, "we're not here to cause trouble. We just need a safe place to rest, for the children's sake." Sawyer didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. Silence had become his armor, his boundary. He'd learned to wield it like a fence around his life, and it had served him well for the better part of 15 years. But the woman didn't flinch under that silence. She took another step forward, shifting the child in her arms. The little girl's face was streaked with dust and tears, her chin trembling. "My name's Eliza Cooper," the woman continued, voice hoarse from hours under the sun. "These are my friends, Ruthie Calhoun and Nora Bell. We've come a long way. We heard you live alone, that you're not the kind of man who slams the door on people like us." Her words landed heavy like truth dressed in desperation, the kind that didn't have the energy left for lies. Sawyer's jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong, he did live alone. He had for years, by design, not accident. People brought questions, needs, consequences. He'd built his life carefully to avoid exactly this kind of moment. But now it stood on his porch with blistered feet and frightened eyes, and the weight of children too small to walk much farther. The boy beside Ruthie looked at Sawyer the way Sawyer had once looked at strangers when he was small, measuring whether the man in front of him was danger or deliverance. That look stirred something he hadn't let himself feel in years. "I've got nothing to offer," Sawyer said finally, voice rough from disuse. "No spare beds, no food made." "We're not asking for comfort," Eliza replied. "Just shelter for one night. They haven't eaten since yesterday morning." That landed hard. Sawyer looked past her toward the boy who now clung to his mother's hand. With fingers gone pale, the baby stirred in Nora's arms and let out a dry, sleepy cough. Without speaking, Sawyer turned and opened the gate. He didn't say the words. He didn't have to. Eliza nodded once in thanks, then started forward, the others following in a quiet shuffle of exhaustion and dust. Inside the house, the air was stale with neglect. Furniture sat like forgotten bones, untouched by warmth or use. A wooden bench lined the wall near the fireplace, and a single chair sat askew under the window. Dust motes swam through light that sliced in like blades from between closed curtains. Eliza settled on the bench, pulling the girl into her lap. Ruthie remained standing, one hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes scanning the room. Nora hovered just inside the doorway as if expecting to be thrown back out. Sawyer stood near the doorframe, arms crossed. "You said you've been walking since morning." "From where 20 miles east," Eliza answered. "A place called Riverside Boarding House." "I know of it," Sawyer muttered. "Barely. You're lucky." He looked up at that. There was something in her tone, tight, controlled. Anger folded beneath politeness. "What happened?" Eliza exchanged a glance with Ruthie, who finally spoke, her voice flat. "The man who ran it said we owed more than rent. He wanted payment, in other ways." "He gave us until sunrise," Nora added, "or else he'd sell us to men who didn't care about consent or children." Sawyer said nothing, but his grip on the windowsill tightened. He knew that kind of man, the kind who fed on fear, who twisted power into profit. "You're safe here," he said. Even as he said it, he wasn't sure where the words came from. The little girl pointed to the fireplace, her voice barely a whisper. "Where's the fire? Haven't needed one in a while," he said. "Maybe you didn't feel the cold," Eliza said softly. Sawyer looked at her and for the first time truly saw her not just a woman begging for mercy, but one carrying her own kind of fire. One who refused to let the world crush her spirit. He turned toward the kitchen. "I'll see what I can cook," he muttered. The house was waking up, and so in ways he didn't yet understand was he. The stew simmering in the pot was little more than beans, dried meat, and old broth, but the smell filled the house with something Sawyer Ridge hadn't known he'd missed life. Laughter didn't echo yet, and trust hadn't been earned, but the walls no longer felt hollow. The children sat quietly at the table, their small hands too tired to fidget. Nora spoon-fed the baby, murmuring something seed in his ear. Ruthie poured water from the pump into tin cups while her son Micah eyed Sawyer like a man watching the edges of a map he hadn't yet decided was safe to cross. Eliza stood near the hearth, arms folded, her silhouette painted in golden light from the oil lamp. She watched him. Not with suspicion, but with waiting. When the stew was served and the children finally began to eat, Sawyer poured himself a cup of water and leaned against the counter. His voice was quiet but firm. "You said the boarding house turned dangerous. What exactly happened?" The women exchanged glances. It was Ruthie who spoke first. Her words were measured, almost rehearsed. "Riverside Boarding House isn't what it claims to be. We were told it was a place for widows, single mothers, women looking to get back on their feet. We were given rooms, meals, and told we could pay off the debt through chores. But that wasn't all they wanted." Eliza added, her voice tight. "Silas Danner, the man who runs the place, started hinting at other expectations. The kind you don't say out loud but make perfectly clear. He gave us a choice," Nora said softly. "Pay in ways we couldn't, or be turned over to someone else who would." Sawyer's stomach turned. He'd heard of men like Danner back when he still had a foot in the world. Predators in clean clothes, businessmen with dirty hands. And the sheriff, he asked, though part of him already knew. "Sheriff Vernon Pike," Eliza replied. "He's not just looking the other way. He's working with Danner, takes his cut, helps keep the women in line." Sawyer felt a slow burn rise in his chest. Pike. He remembered the man, thick-set, smug, full of the kind of authority that didn't come from honor, but from knowing where the bribes came from. Years ago, Pike had refused to investigate a traveling doctor who denied Sawyer's family medicine because they couldn't pay. Emma's fever, Sarah's screams, the quiet after. He knew Pike's name too well. "Why come here?" Sawyer asked, quieter now. "There was a woman in town," Ruthie said, older, scar on her cheek, said she'd worked this land once before your family passed. Her name was June," Eliza added. "She told us, if there was one man in the county who might help women like us, it was you." Sawyer looked away. He remembered June. She'd tended the garden in the early days, laughed loud, wore boots too big. She was there the day they buried Emma. "You walked 20 miles on the word of someone who hadn't seen me in a decade," he asked. "It wasn't much to bet on," Eliza admitted. "But we were out of options, and she said you'd understand what it meant to lose everything." The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but true. Before Sawyer could speak again, there was a knock, sharp, deliberate, on the front door. He moved instinctively, stepping between the women and the window. Eliza pressed her hand against her chest, eyes flicking toward the back room where the children had retreated. Ruthie reached for Micah, pulling him close. Sawyer grabbed the rifle, leaning beside the doorframe. The knock came again, firmer now. Then a voice, "Mr. Ridge. Sheriff Vernon Pike. I'm gonna need you to open this door." Sawyer's blood froze. He didn't have to look to know it was him. That voice, calculated friendliness layered over menace. Eliza moved to the edge of the hallway, barely whispering, "Please don't let him take us." Sawyer said nothing. He opened the door just wide enough to step out onto the porch, rifle in plain sight. The sheriff stood at the bottom of the steps, flanked by another man, thin, sharp-eyed, all slicked-back hair and arrogance. Silas Danner. He looked like he'd been carved from the same rotten wood as every saloon owner and debt collector Sawyer had run out of town 2 decades earlier. "Evening," Pike drawled. "Didn't expect to find your gate open. Thought I'd check in." "Not a good time," Sawyer replied coldly. The stranger Danner stepped forward. "We're looking for 3 women. Ran out on a debt. Stole some things that weren't theirs to take." "Don't know anything about that," Sawyer said. "Haven't seen anyone." Danner narrowed his eyes. "That's odd. We tracked footprints straight to your fence." Pike chuckled. "Must be quite the coincidence." Inside the house, a floorboard creaked. Then a small cry a child muffled quickly. But the sound carried. Danner grinned like he'd struck gold. "You sure you don't have company, Ridge?" Sawyer raised the rifle slightly. "This is private land. I don't recall issuing invitations." Pike's hand hovered near his holster. "Harboring fugitives is a serious offense. Kidnapping women and calling it debt collection is worse." That was when Danner dropped the act. "Those women are mine," he snapped. "Bought and paid for." Sawyer's jaw clenched. "They're not yours. They're people. Mothers. And you'll turn that horse around before you find out what else I've got loaded in this rifle." Pike glanced at Danner, who looked like he wanted to charge forward but held back. The air thickened. The sun was dipping low now, casting long shadows across the porch. Danner muttered something under his breath. Pike cleared his throat. "We'll be back," he said. "With warrants. Bring them." Sawyer answered. "But don't bring lies." As the men retreated down the path, Sawyer turned to find Eliza in the doorway, Micah at her side. She looked shaken but not broken. He nodded toward the back room. "Keep them close. This isn't over." And he knew it wasn't, because trouble had knocked and it now knew his name. The following morning dawned thick with tension. Sawyer Ridge had barely slept. He'd kept the rifle across his lap and a lantern flickering low in the window all night, not for comfort but as a signal. This house isn't empty, and it won't be surrendered. He knew the knock that came yesterday wouldn't be the last, and he knew men like Silas Danner didn't back off after a polite warning. Inside the house, the air had shifted. Eliza had moved with quiet focus, helping Ruthie and Nora tend to the children, preparing bread and heating water over a low fire. Micah had barely spoken but stayed close to the window. His eyes sharp with the unspoken instinct of a boy who knew danger had found them. The baby slept in a basket near the hearth. The toddler clung to her mother's skirt, thumb in mouth. They were waiting, just like Sawyer was. But it wasn't fear that filled the house. It was readiness. A decision had already been made the moment Sawyer opened his door. Now they were just bracing for the cost. By noon, dust rose again on the main road. Sawyer spotted the riders before they reached the gate, 2 men same as before. Sheriff Pike rode out front, his badge catching the sun like it meant something. Danner followed, face set like stone, but this time Sawyer could see a coiled fury in his shoulders. Sawyer stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed low. "You weren't invited," he said simply. "Didn't need to be," Pike replied, dismounting. "Got business to finish. I told you yesterday this is private land. You come back here waving empty threats and we're gonna find out how serious you are about crossing lines." Danner dismounted, not bothering with pleasantries this time. "I gave those women a place to live, a way to pay off their debt, and they ran like thieves. They owe me 6 months of service." "You're calling human beings a transaction," Sawyer said coldly. "No," Danner replied. "I'm calling them mine." Behind him, the front door creaked open. Eliza stepped out slowly, arms raised in a calm, open gesture. "If you have something to say," she said, voice unwavering, "say it to me. But leave this man out of it." Sawyer's heart pounded. "Get back inside," he told her. "No," she said softly. "We've hidden long enough." Within seconds, Ruthie followed, one arm wrapped around Micah's shoulder. Nora emerged last, clutching the baby to her chest. The 3 women stood side by side, their children huddled behind them, forming a silent wall against the violence that threatened to break over them. Sheriff Pike tilted his head, mockingly casual. "Well, well, the whole crew." Danner took a step forward. "You broke contract. You were bought and fed. You knew the deal. You mean the deal where you sell us like livestock?" Ruthie said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "You signed those papers," Danner snarled. "Under duress." With threats, Nora answered. "You preyed on women with no one left to call. That's not a contract, that's a trap." Micah stepped forward, slipping out of Ruthie's hold. He was shaking, but he stood tall. "My mom isn't for sale." The silence that followed was heavier than a gunshot. Danner stared at the boy, then barked out a humorless laugh. "Kid doesn't understand how the world works. He understands better than you ever will," Sawyer said, stepping forward to stand beside Eliza. "He understands that no man owns another. He understands that being poor doesn't mean being worthless. You don't want this fight," Ridge Pike warned. "You got women and children under your roof. Bullets don't discriminate." "No, but men do," Sawyer replied. "And I've seen what happens when decent folks don't stand up to predators in badges and suits." "I didn't then. I do now." Pike and Danner exchanged a look, calculating. Danner's hand hovered too close to his holster. Eliza stepped in front of Sawyer now, even as he tried to pull her back. "You'll have to shoot through us," she said, eyes locked with Pike's. "But if you do, this man won't be the only one you'll have to bury." The words weren't empty. They carried something deeper, a mother's oath backed by exhaustion, fear, and absolute unwillingness to go back. Pike took a breath. "You realize you're making yourselves outlaws, right? Better an outlaw," Ruthie said, than a prisoner. It was then that hoofbeats echoed from beyond the hill. More riders. Danner's face lit with anticipation, but that hope vanished when Sawyer smiled. "Hope you brought reinforcements," Danner sneered. "I didn't," Sawyer replied, "but someone else might have." The riders crested the hill, 5 of them. At the front rode Boone McCready, a weathered cattleman with a jaw like granite and a stare that could freeze a rattlesnake. He pulled his horse to a stop and looked down at the scene below like a judge from the Old Testament. Sheriff Boone said slowly, "Why are you pointing guns at women and children?" "Law business," Pike replied, suddenly unsure. "Funny. Looks more like cowardice." Boone dismounted. His men followed. Each one armed, each one steady. Danner's face twisted. This ain't your concern. It became my concern, Boone said, when I started hearing about women disappearing from a place called Riverside. When I saw these children crying on a stranger's porch. He turned to the sheriff. You gonna stand behind a man like this, Pike? The sheriff didn't answer. Danner stepped forward again, gun now in hand. I'm done talking. He raised it toward Micah. Ruthie screamed. Sawyer moved, but Boone moved faster. His rifle cracked. Danner spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder. Blood soaked through his sleeve, but he was alive. Boone lowered his weapon. You don't point guns at kids, he said. Not in this county. Pike reached for his holster, but found 5 guns pointed back at him. Don't, Boone said. You're already on the wrong side of history. Don't make it worse. For the first time in years, Sawyer Ridge felt something he hadn't dared feel in a long time. He wasn't alone. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, the odds were starting to balance. Time slowed. The shot that dropped Silas Danner echoed across the dry Wyoming air like thunder cracking open Judgment Day. He hit the dirt-hard blood blooming from his shoulder as his pistol skittered out of reach. The scream he let out was more rage than pain, rage at being wounded, at being challenged, at losing control of what he believed he owned. On the porch, Micah stood frozen. Ruthie lunged, wrapping her arms around her son and dragging him backward, whispering reassurances even as her voice trembled. The women clustered around the children like a shield of flesh and resolve. Nora cradled her infant so tightly that Sawyer could see the child's tiny fist imprinting her dress. Sawyer's rifle remained steady, aimed squarely at Sheriff Pike. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The barrel of that Winchester said everything the past 15 years of silence had not. Pike's eyes scanned the yard, the porch, the wounded man groaning on the ground, Boone McCready and his 4 ranch hands now fanned out in a semicircle, each with a rifle ready. He'd walked into a negotiation backed by power, but now he stood ankle-deep in a reckoning. You gonna draw? Sawyer asked, voice low-measured. The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster. But in his gut, he already knew he wouldn't leave the Ridge Ranch alive if he made the wrong move. Instead, he slowly lifted his arms, palms open. Boone McCready stepped forward, boots crunching the gravel. Pick up your man, he said, and get off this land. Tell whatever courthouse you serve that out here we don't sell women, we don't threaten children, and we sure as hell don't back cowards. Pike hesitated. You think this ends here? Boone didn't blink. No, I think this is where it begins. The sheriff bent to help Danner to his feet. The wounded man spat blood and curses into the dirt. This ain't over, he growled. It is for you, Sawyer said, stepping down from the porch. Because if either of you come back here, I won't miss next time. The threat wasn't barked. It was promised. Pike and Danner mounted up, the latter hunched and unsteady. As they rode off, the dust trailed behind them like shame on a wind. Only when they were gone did the silence shift. Not the silence of fear, the silence of relief. Clarabelle, no. Eliza turned to Sawyer, her lips trembling but her voice firm. You didn't have to stand with us. I did, Sawyer answered. Because I didn't once, and I've regretted it every day since. She studied him as if searching for the man behind the grief, and maybe for the first time he let himself be seen. Boone clapped him on the shoulder. I always wondered what you'd do if the world came knocking again. Sawyer didn't respond. He just looked back at the porch, at the children now cautiously coming out from behind their mothers, their little faces sun-touched and solemn, clutching wooden nos and old fears. Micah walked over his steps, careful but determined. Mr. Ridge Sawyer crouched slightly to meet his eyes. Yeah, son. The boy held out something in his hand, a small leather pouch. This fell from that man's coat, he said. Do you want it? Sawyer looked inside. A list, names, ages, women, children, a ledger of ownership. His stomach turned. "No," he said quietly, "burn it." And with that, a boy who had almost been sold lit a fire that sent those names up to the sky, untethered at last. That evening, the porch was filled not with fear, but conversation. Boone and his men shared jerky stories and promises. The women brought out what food they had salvaged. The children played near the fence, chasing shadows and bugs, the laughter raw and shaky but real. Sawyer leaned against the railing, arms crossed, watching as his land, once a graveyard of memory, was now becoming a haven. Eliza approached him quietly, her daughter asleep against her shoulder. "We'll move on in the morning," she said. "We've taken enough of your peace." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think peace is silence?" She smiled faintly. "Isn't it?" "No," he said. "It's knowing the right people are under your roof, that what you hear at night, footsteps, a child's laugh, is something worth keeping alive." She stared at him. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying this ranch has been quiet too long," he interrupted. "It could use the noise." Nora joined them, her infant finally asleep in her arms. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You've lived alone for so long." "Too long," he admitted. "But I'm tired of waiting for the dead to come back. It's time to live with the living." Ruthie laughed softly behind him. "That boy of mine's gonna tear up your fence." "I'll teach him how to build one," Sawyer replied. Boone rose from the table and stretched. "You've done a good thing here, Ridge. But if you ever need help, just whistle. You're not alone anymore." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky, soft pink and orange, Sawyer Ridge stood on his porch, watching three women who had fought like lions and children who had survived what no child should, and felt something settle inside him. Not grief, not guilt, belonging. He turned to Eliza one last time that night. "You asked if I'd ever had peace. I didn't. Not until now." And when she placed her daughter, still clutching the wooden horse once carved for Emma, into his arms and whispered, "Thank you for choosing us," he realized the truth of it. He hadn't chosen them. They had saved him. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life on Sawyer Ridge's land began to change. The wind still whistled through the canyon in the evenings, and the coyotes still howled from the ridgeline. But now those sounds were joined by others' footsteps on the porch. Children laughing at twilight, the creak of a rocking chair occupied again. The house that had once sat like a tomb on the edge of the prairie had awakened. Sawyer didn't speak about the past much. He didn't have to. The way he fixed the broken barn door so Micah could sleep with the window cracked. The way he carved new wooden toys to replace the few that had survived the road. The way he stepped out each morning to check the perimeter before anyone else stirred. It was all there, the care of a man who had learned finally that love was worth the risk. Eliza Cooper began teaching in the nearby schoolhouse, her presence commanding yet kind. Ruthie Calhoun opened a small bakery at the edge of town, her son Micah helping her load bread into baskets before dawn. Nora Bell tended a garden behind the ranch, coaxing color and nourishment from the same soil that had once held only dust. And Sawyer, he found his hands busy again, but this time not just with repair, but with purpose. He taught Micah to mend fences and showed the girls how to care for the horses. He replaced old floorboards and reopened windows that hadn't seen light in 15 years. Sometimes he sat on the porch alone, whittling, but he wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Every so often he'd glance over and see a child curled up asleep with a book, or hear Eliza humming in the kitchen, or watch Ruthie dancing with flour on her apron, spinning Micah around until both were breathless. And each time it hit him like a soft blow to the chest. This is what I almost lived without. The ghosts of Sarah and Emma still lingered, but not in grief, in gratitude. He felt them in the way Eliza's daughter clutched the wooden horse with both hands, her thumb tracing the grooves he'd once carved for Emma's 4th birthday. He saw them in Micah's shy grin when he finally nailed a beam straight, and in the strength of Eliza's voice when she read to the children by lamplight. One evening, Boone Macready returned, tipping his hat and bringing along 2 horses as gifts for the children. He didn't stay long, he never did, but before he rode off, he looked at Sawyer and said simply, "You did more than take them in. You let them bring you back." Sawyer nodded, the words too heavy for reply. He stood on that porch long after Boone had disappeared into the trees, watching the sun fall low over the fields. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't dread the dark. Inside the house glowed lamplight, flickering laughter spilling through cracks that once echoed only songs. It was no longer a sanctuary of pain. It was a place of protection, of healing, of beginnings. Sawyer Ridge hadn't set out to become a guardian, a father figure, or the keeper of someone else's future, but sometimes the life you think is ending is just the beginning of another one. Quieter, harder, but full of grace, and in the end it wasn't the rifle, the land, or the walls that kept them safe. It was the choice to stand for what was right, to face down what once broke him, and to open a door that had stayed closed for far too long. Because in the unforgiving West, survival was never promised, but home was something you built together. This story offers a powerful reminder that healing often begins not with grand gestures, but with quiet, courageous choices like opening a door, offering shelter, or simply refusing to look away from someone else's pain. Through Sawyer Ridge's transformation from a grieving recluse into a protector and provider, we learn that redemption is never out of reach, even for those who have buried themselves beneath guilt and sins. His journey shows us that true strength isn't found in isolation or self-preservation, but in standing up for the vulnerable, even when it costs us comfort, safety, or the illusion of peace. The women, too, teach us something vital, that dignity and resistance can take many forms, and that a mother's love is among the fiercest forces in the world. In the face of injustice, they do not cower, they stand. And in doing so, they awaken not only protection in others, but purpose. Perhaps the most enduring lesson here is this: when we let people in, truly in, we don't just save them, they save us right back. In a world that often tells us to guard our hearts, to fend for ourselves, this story, gently but firmly, offers a counter-truth that connection, empathy, and moral courage are the lifelines that pull us from the wreckage of our own sorrow. Whether we are Sawyer, Eliza, Ruthie, or Micah, we all carry wounds, and we all have the power to choose whether those wounds keep us guarded or become the very reason we reach out, protect, and rebuild. In the end, what matters isn't what we've lost. It's what we choose to become afterward, and who we're brave enough to become it with. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Frontier Reverie, where courage, redemption, and quiet resilience take center stage in every tale. We bring you deeply emotional Western stories that echo long after they end. Hit the like button, share with someone who needs hope, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Join our growing community where stories heal and voices, no matter how quiet, are heard. Welcome to the frontier.